All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for having me today and for taking the time to join us. I am really flattered to be put in a lineup immediately after Mel. I know she's such an incredible resource, and I learn so much from her every time I'm in the same physical or virtual room. So that's really, really lovely. Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about myths and facts about drugs. I think an important thing to know going into this is that, as stated so kindly in my introduction, I'm an interdisciplinary researcher. But I am a cultural anthropologist sort of by trade, which means that I am super interested in how people understand things, how people make sense of what's going on with stories. When I was asked, sort of at the dinner table with family to explain what it is that I do, I might say, well, epidemiologists, for example, are interested in how many people get the flu shot, and clinicians might be interested in how likely receiving a flu shot reduces your risk of the flu. And cultural medical anthropologists, we ask questions like, what determines whether someone decides to get up off the couch and go to CVS to get a flu shot today? Or how do they prioritize that? Or what does it mean to them? Or what's scary about it? Or what's exciting about it? Those are the sort of things we do. But I also do have an interdisciplinary background. I am one of what I believe to be a lovely cadre of late diagnosed neurodivergent people, which explains why I never stopped getting degrees in things and why people are so wonderful and strange and fascinating to me. So I do have training in infectious disease, epidemiology, sociology, clinical research, and a few other things as well. So what that means is that there is a almost 100% likelihood that I am going to be saying things based on the diversity of our audience that you already know. But hopefully what I'm able to offer is to bring those things that you know into connection with other things that you haven't learned yet. So that would be my goal. Right. So a couple of quick disclosures. I am an ongoing contractor and consultant with the National Association of Counties. If you are working on implementing opioid remediation strategies in your county, you may have come across some of their lovely resources. I have been paid to write those. I am also occasionally on and off a contractor and consultant with the Center for Prevention Services in Charlotte, North Carolina. Those are my financial interests. Intangibly, I am a contractor and consultant via IPA with the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. That means the CDC buys a certain amount of my time away from my university. So I don't benefit financially from that, but insofar as the work is its own reward, you could say I benefit from that. And I am very proud to be an advisory board member at the North Carolina Survivors Union, which is the largest drug users union in the South. And so the objectives today are to provide a fuller understanding of the true risks posed by fentanyl, like who is most at risk, why not. We'll be unpacking that within a certain framework. To describe the current science on the risk and safety profiles of illicit drugs and medications for substance use disorder during pregnancy. Mel already did an incredible job with this, so I'm just going to be offering a couple additive things to bring them into our framework. And to dispel some pervasive drug myths by describing their origins, because I know the origins of a lot of them, and why they don't necessarily hold up to scrutiny. So because I could talk about this for literally hours, and I was very generously given one, I had to sort of decide what to include and what to not include in this particular talk. And the way that I framed what to include here is thinking about essentially service and helper roles, someone who might be conducting a home visit, for example. Now, if you're a primary care physician or something in that role, you're not doing home visits, but I'm still thinking of you as someone who serves adolescents, adults, children. You're working with an entire family, perhaps offering services and support to a whole unit. So the sort of thought that I had going into this is what can we arm folks with going into a real or proverbial home visit surfing with families? So the major topics I'm going to cover are these. I want to talk about opioid overdose, and I want to offer a slightly different framework for thinking about how it happens, what drives it, and what prevents it. It's a different framework that I have found really, really helpful for thinking differently and, in my opinion, more effectively about what it is so that we can respond to it. Unpacking a couple of really big tools and concerns, so naloxone, fentanyl, and I'll be touching on cannabis briefly. The competing terrain of priorities that is pregnancy, and I want to really underscore what Mel offered, which is that overall wisdom that this is a terrain of competing priorities, and there's no perfect answer. There's only the the answer that is most acceptable for, each person at each time. And if we're going to adopt the philosophy of support, don't punish, which I encourage us to do for reasons I'll get into, what are some skills and resources that we can take with us to do that? All right, so beginning with opioid overdose. What is opioid overdose? Now, let me shift a little bit here. Okay, so overdose is something that happens when the therapeutic window essentially is exceeded. So if we look at this drawing on the right, this is, if we can imagine, it's a graph, like an illustration of what it looks like when we take a medication. So, so last week I had an outpatient procedure, and they sent me home with a lot of extra strength Tylenol, and gave me some very, very strict suggestions, or not even like instructions about how much Tylenol to take, how much Tylenol to not take, because it can be very dangerous. And ultimately, the goal of all those instructions I received was to make sure that I was controlling my discomfort by keeping the amount of Tylenol in my system in that therapeutic window, in a place where I have enough there to actually get the sort of pain relief and relief from the discomfort that I needed, but not so much that I start having side effects, right? That's what we call the therapeutic window. It's enough to do the work you needed to do, but not so much that you're having side effects that can be problematic, possibly toxic, or, especially in the case of Tylenol, particularly deadly. Now, drugs with a narrower therapeutic window can present a higher overdose risk, especially if tolerance or dosage can't be controlled. And I think Tylenol is a really, really great example here because it has a relatively narrow therapeutic window. I actually imagine most people on this call are aware of the fact that Tylenol has a very serious overdose risk if you take too much. It can kill you very quickly and very effectively unless you are receiving the sort of antidote medication for it. And we used to have a number of Tylenol-related deaths every year, mostly connected to the fact that parents were misdosing accidentally their own children due to a misunderstanding between how infants' Tylenol and children's Tylenol was labeled. And so as it should have, consumer protections kicked in, some of the labeling was changed, some of the dosing was changed. And now that we have this really, really steady over-the-counter supply of Tylenol that we can navigate better, we don't have that many hospitalizations or fatalities around Tylenol. I mean, it does happen. There's 8 billion people in the world, right? But it's very, very rare. Fentanyl, in my opinion, is a more dangerous sort of substance because it, has a relatively narrow therapeutic window, not because it is strong per se, right? So when we think about how does opioid overdose happen, what's actually happening in the body at this time, we're moving into that red territory, right? It means we've moved through the therapeutic window and we are now receiving side effects. Everyone meet my cat. So opioid overdose happens because opioids depress the central nervous system. It takes advantage of bodily functions that we already have. Our body already knows how to calm us down, how to put us to sleep, how to slow down our breathing, especially when we've been really hyped up and we need to settle down. So it takes those and really just sort of accelerates them into slowing down. So they slow down parts of your brain that give you anxiety, parts of your brain that keep you awake, and parts of your brain that keep you breathing even when you're sleeping, right? And so overdose happens when these vital brain functions slow down so much that you don't breathe at all. So if we think about then what drives overdose, so what sends people into that red territory if they're using an illicit drug supply? Now, if we think about overdose, not as a consequence of exposure to risky substances, but as the inability to dose properly, right? So like an overdose, something that takes us out of that green window, we know that if we have someone's tolerance to like metabolize and handle a particular drug safely, and the dose that they take lining up, you're going to get a therapeutic dose. But if those things change, then you can run into the territory of potentially deadly accident. And it's very, very well established in literature that changes in tolerance can drive overdose. Some of the best data comes from North Carolina, actually. Some of the work that's been done around overdose mortality among formerly incarcerated people. It's the work of our DHHS staff and other colleagues that have really driven home the fact that people are between 40 and 70 times more likely to overdose on illicit opioids in the first 2 weeks after release from incarceration. That's because their tolerance is in the gutter, and even people coming out, returning to use, attempting to be very cautious can still really easily overdo it. There's other evidence that really clearly documents that in addition to periods of incarceration, periods of abstinence-based treatment, periods of self-elected abstinence. For example, if someone stopped using for a long time and then reinitiated use, even detox without medication continuation are all risk factors for overdose because people's tolerance have dropped and they don't know what an appropriate dose for themselves are. A lot of the research that I've been doing is also pointing out, really highlighting something that has been, I think, a known factor both within harm reduction communities and among all the first responders that I work with, including police, fire, EMT, anyone who's paying attention will tell you that this is the case because they see it on a regular basis, that there are changes in the drug supply as a result of disruption that also causes overdose. So like when this was first explained to me, it was by an EMT in Manchester, New Hampshire, who was like, every single time we have a major drug bust, we have to like restock all of our ambulances with extra naloxone because everyone's falling out everywhere because the drug supply has been disrupted and no one knows what the dose is anymore because there's new supply, it's different, whatever. We were actually able to quantify the impact of drug seizures on overdose in Indianapolis, Indiana, with the study on the left that came out last summer. We found that overdose doubled within a couple block radius of where drug seizures happened in the weeks after that drug seizure happened, due largely to disruption in the supply. So this is a good way to think about overdose: changes in tolerance or change in dose. And the opposite of overdose then is just a proper dose. So if we think about what prevents overdose, full disclosure, I was the first author on this particular document, but this was one of the most solid literature reviews I've ever done. I've often joked that this is the most peer-reviewed document I've ever written in my life because there were hundreds of hands on it before it went out into the public. But we were able to look at every single thing that had evidence behind it. And we came up with these. So medications for opioid use disorder, and specifically opioid agonist medications, not naltrexone. Naltrexone is associated with an increased overdose risk, which is why it should be approached with extreme caution. Targeted naloxone distribution, so getting it into the hands of the people most likely to use it. Screening for fentanyl in routine clinical toxicology. At the time, we didn't have the evidence base for drug checking. We now have the evidence base for drug checking, so people don't have to consume the drugs before we can look at the drugs for insight and reduce overdose risk by applying that insight to our practices. At this point, drug checking by far meets the criteria for evidence-based overdose prevention. Syringe service programs. I will say we actually found that overdose prevention centers was perhaps the most effective overdose prevention strategy that we could find in the literature, but because it was prevented by federal law, the CDC wasn't allowed to advocate for it. And so we actually included language that explained why it was not included in there, but it met inclusion criteria. And then everything else that's included in this document as an evidence-based overdose prevention strategy is just a way to reduce barriers to the strategies that are above. So like eliminating prior auth, academic detailing for healthcare providers, getting these things into criminal justice settings, 911 Good Samaritan laws so that people don't experience barriers to seeking help, all of this. And so I think an important question to look at is like, if these are the things, and I mean the thing, like we didn't leave anything out. This is it, right? This is what we have evidence for as an overdose prevention strategy. If there's something else that you're doing, there's no evidence behind it, 100%. So when we look at these and we're like, all right, what is in common with these things? Like what unites them together? I would argue that it fits this model of the prevention of overdose means making sure that tolerance and dose can match, right? So MOUD or safe supply, naloxone, drug checking, syringe programs, OPCs, do they directly address the underlying problem of dose intolerance unpredictability? Yes. Right. Naloxone directly addresses the problem by saying, like, if these are unpredictable, here's how you can respond to it. Medications for opioid use disorder provide a stable supply. SSPs can help connect people to a stable supply, to medication. It all works in this way. They are all of them developed by people who use drugs, who are at risk of overdose and best understand those risks. I sort of softened the green in the MOUD column because, you know, we know which clinical researchers developed medications for opioid use disorder, but it has been adopted by drug user unions and drug user advocacy groups as a source of safe supply. In fact, one of the like mantras of the North Carolina Survivors Union is that methadone is their safe supply, and that's why we should be dropping barriers to it. all of these other things have been developed by directly impacted people, which I think is really, really important. And then three, they're all evidence-based, which means that even if they were developed with just intuition at the time, we now know that they are deeply, deeply effective at what they do. Whereas when I'm talking to communities about their opioid mitigation plans and they come up with like literally anything else, these are the questions that I have for them. Does it directly address the underlying problem of dose intolerance and predictability? Right? Was it developed by people who use drugs? This is actually one of my major complaints about post-overdose response teams is that there is no evidence base behind post-overdose response teams. And I have yet to see any community where drug user advocates are like, oh boy, oh boy, oh boy, I'm so excited for someone to come to my house and knock on the door. It's just not community-based. And so this is what's always sort of I think should drive caution in really innovating outside the box when we're not paying attention to these particular things. All right. So taking that framework and applying it to some of the principles that we know can help us prevent overdose, and this is for young people, old people, everyone. One question that I get asked a lot is how much naloxone do you actually need to reverse an overdose? And this comes up more and more as additional naloxone products come to market that advertise being longer acting. It's not a naloxone product. There's a nalmefene products that are coming out that claim to be sort of stronger acting than naloxone, or higher dose naloxone products, like 8 milligram naloxone sprays and things of that nature. And oftentimes, because we live in a for-profit pharmaceutical industry, they're telling you why their product is so much more important and so much better than all the rest. So let's address that, right? So I think one thing that's important to keep in mind as I explain this is I'm going to be kind of dipping back and forth between statements of fact and metaphor, mostly just to keep this from going above my pay grade or going too into the weeds with stuff. I'm going to try to highlight when I do that for you, when we go from factual statements to sort of conceptual statements. But it is helpful, I find, to think about opioid substances, many others, but opioids too, as being characterized by two major features. One is binding affinity, which means does it interact with the receptor, or does it attach to the receptor? Like, does the key fit into the keyhole? Does it have anything to do with those opioid receptors in the brain? Right. And then there is receptor activation, which is does the key turn in the lock? So whether or not it likes that receptor and attaches to it, does it do anything once it gets there? And those are very, very different types of characteristics to think about, right? So we often think about fentanyl as a more potent substance because it has stronger effects, but that's about receptor activation, right? It's not about binding affinity or the sort of like magnetism metaphorically between the opioids and the receptor, right? So naloxone reverses overdoses by having a stronger binding affinity than most other opioids, right? Which means that when the opioid is sort of like floating around in your system, trying to attach to those receptors, trying to get into the keyhole, and then once it gets there, turning the lock and really setting off these processes that we talked about earlier, can put you to sleep, can slow your breathing, and can be deadly if you move into that red overdose territory. Naloxone tries to beat its way to the receptor. Now, metaphorically, we sometimes talk about naloxone just like latching onto the receptor and holding on really tight. You know, in reality, everything is just sort of like attaching and deattaching and reattaching and deattaching constantly to these receptors. So it's more logical, or at least in my mind, I found it much more helpful to think about it more like a game of musical chairs. Right. So the chairs are your opioid receptors, and the people playing musical chairs are things that want to attach, that have a binding affinity to those opioid receptors. Right. So that could be opioids, it could be naloxone. And as they're constantly playing that game, just imagine that, you know, the naloxone is someone who is like on the ball, totally focused, hyper competitive, really athletic, and you know, the opioids are an underslept parent who hasn't had their coffee in the morning, right? The naloxone is just going to beat it to the chair every single time. So one reason why I think this is really helpful is that when we think about how much naloxone do we need to reverse an overdose, the follow-up question shouldn't be, well, how strong is the opioid, right? Because that gets us to a place where we're talking about receptor activation. And we're not worried about receptor activation, we're worried about binding affinity. We're worried about naloxone beating the fentanyl or the heroin or whatever to the receptor, right? we are curious to know, essentially, the question is answered by how many opioid receptors do you have? Like, how many chairs are there, right? In this metaphor, if we think about our system like musical chairs, and naloxone is competing in the game of musical chairs, how many chairs you have determines how much naloxone you need, right? And so that's really about the size of your body, or like how brains are put together, and not about the strength, so to speak, of the drugs that you have taken. So this has been held up by research for a very long period of time in harm reduction settings. We know that people who use drugs have not required more naloxone in order to reverse overdoses, even as fentanyl has come into the scene. Recently, in February, there is a piece that came out in MMRW where they did the same thing. It was a much more systematic effort where they gave some law enforcement officers 4 milligram naloxone, which is standard, and some officers 8 milligram naloxone. And the only difference is that the people who received more naloxone physically felt worse when they woke up. They just had greater withdrawal symptoms. So yeah, oftentimes when we hear about people receiving multiple doses of naloxone, there's very also frequently evidence that that is maybe not harmful. And I often train people, like, if you're panicked, if you're not, like, just give the naloxone. It's going to be okay. But we could call it clinically inappropriate administration of naloxone, especially instances where you hear about first responders needing like 16 doses. Like, no, they didn't. No one needs that much. All right. So this myth, can you overdose by touching fentanyl? So this is one that is, oops, excuse me. This is one that is, I think, particularly important myth to dispel for me, because I was sitting at the CDC, badged at the CDC, when this myth sort of emerged. And, the short answer is no. And there is a number of reasons why. I think you don't have to take my word for it. I encourage you to take the word of, oh, I should have looked it up. I'm going to get these acronyms wrong. I am 85% sure it's the American College of Medical Toxicologists and the American Association of Clinical Toxicologists. If someone knows better, please throw it in the chat. But there's two different toxicology professional groups who published a joint position statement in 2017, I'll point out to you, about occupational exposure to fentanyl and exposure through emergency responders. And they came down very, very clearly on the side of that this is so unlikely that if it ever actually does happen in reality, that's extremely noteworthy, right? Like one for the textbooks. And here's how they put it. So they said fentanyl is amenable to transdermal absorption, so through the skin, because of its low molecular weight and its lipophilicity. So it can pass through the skin. And depending on the specific product, transdermal delivery system, or patches, take 3 to 13 hours to produce therapeutic serum fentanyl concentrations, and 35 hours to reach peak concentration. So what that tells us, if we think back to the first slide, and there's that yellow, not quite effective dose, the green therapeutic window where it's doing what it should do, which is pain control, handling discomfort, and then there's the red, which is overdose. It takes products that were developed to push fentanyl through the skin hours just to get to a place where your pain is under control, let alone to a place where you're overdosing and you're experiencing toxic concerns. And I think mentioning that happens through a specifically developed patch is also really important, because those patches were specifically designed to push fentanyl through the skin. It's not something it wants to do on its own. This is a second statement that I excerpted from their position statement. It says, and it's very technical, but I'll translate this in a second. They said, incidental dermal absorption is unlikely to cause opioid toxicity. That means if you just come into contact with your skin, it's unlikely that you're going to overdose. If bilateral palmar surfaces were covered with fentanyl patches, which means if you took both hands and just like quilted them with fentanyl patches on both hands, it would take about 14 minutes to receive 100 mics of fentanyl. And this extreme example illustrates that even a high dose of fentanyl prepared for transdermal administration cannot rapidly deliver a high dose. Okay. There's also, I think, a really, really great study that came out as a case study in pre-hospital disaster medicine in 2002. This is a hospital toxicologist who wrote up a case report on himself, actually, when he had an aqueous fentanyl solution. So it's in essence fentanyl like suspended, dissolved in water, and he knocked something over. Didn't even have a cat in his office and still knocked something over, and he managed to spill fentanyl all across his hands. And I actually spoke to this guy a little bit after it was published. He's a lovely human being, so knowledgeable, has a fantastic toxicology podcast. But he had his experience was sort of like, oh man, I just made a big mess. Oh, wait, this is a great teaching moment. And so figure one, which I love, it says hand visibly soiled with fentanyl. This is clearly like this person like took a cell phone shot of his own hand. And this is his hand soaked in fentanyl. He even points to where he has several cuts on his hand. And the end result of the case study was like person washed their hands and then experienced no effects whatsoever. There's plenty of other examples out there, but I thought this one was a particularly compelling one. There are a number of cases out there where people report to have experienced overdose as a result of incidental contact with fentanyl. I think that these reports should be taken seriously, but should not be taken as genuine fentanyl toxicology events, and I'll explain why. 0 cases of alleged fentanyl toxicity from incidental contact have been toxicologically confirmed, which means that every single instance that I'm aware of where the toxicology, like they took blood samples from this person in the hospital post alleged overdose event, confirms that they actually had no opioids in the system at their time, in their system at the time. And so every other case that doesn't have that toxicology, like we don't know, but it presented the same. And there's really no reason to assume that this is the one person with just like magically different skin than every other human being on the planet, right? So there's reports and there's supposition from people who are not clinical experts who believe that's what happened to them. But I don't know, we've all been on WebMD and convinced ourselves that something is going on when that's not actually what's going on, right? The symptom most commonly described in most of these events align with panic attacks, not opioid toxicity. As someone who used to suffer a lot of panic attacks with my own post-traumatic stress disorder about a decade ago, I had really severe, very disruptive symptoms following some events that happened in 2013 and 2014. And I can tell you, they are really good at convincing you are about to die. Like really good, really good at it. And they're terrifying, and I wouldn't wish them on anybody. But they are, again, not overdoses. In most cases, if you have, sometimes there's body cam footage or things like that, the affected persons are conscious, they're breathing at the time of their emergency. Some of the times they're talking. If you're talking, you're not overdosing. So we have lots of evidence that these are not actual overdoses. And in addition, this was a concern that was raised, I mean, appropriately, when this was suggested that it was happening. Federal agencies took it seriously. Federal agencies in the US took it seriously. In Canada took it seriously. In the UK took it seriously. And every other country that took this seriously has since very clearly dialed back that warning. In fact, the Royal Mounties in Canada said that they created a bit of a monster by telling people that this was actually something that they could possibly experience. For me, this makes me particularly angry on behalf of other people because I believe that there is nothing more cruel or toxic that you could do than convince someone that their life is literally on the line when that's not the case, especially if that person is a first responder and is already sort of adopting a professional role that requires them to do so in the first place. And so, yeah, it actually, I think it makes me quite angry that we had a number of people in positions of authority who were in agencies who have built up trust as authorities who know what they're talking about, who sort of took this prime time without actually clarifying if this was even possible, without actually talking to any clinical experts. I think that was, our public servants deserve so much better than that. Another thing that this raises for me and concern is that, like, if we have so many people who believe that they're experiencing an overdose when they're clearly not, what that means is we have a lot of public servants who can't properly identify overdose. And this was a concern that was actually raised to me by a colleague who is a retired chief of police who I work with really closely on a number of different projects. He even told me an incident where I don't believe the suspicion was overdose, but several officers that he was patrolling with, like very early in his career, believed that a colleague of theirs was having some sort of medical situation where they're like, oh, you're having a panic attack, or like they didn't think it was very serious because they didn't interpret his symptoms seriously. And in reality, this individual was experiencing testicular torsion and needed medical treatment like immediately in order to be safe and well. And so, the idea is sort of that, like, even if a person is not overdosing, that doesn't mean that they are having a panic attack. They could be having a stroke. They could be having an aortic aneurysm. Like there could be many, many things that could be happening. And if we're wasting time giving them 20, 30 doses of naloxone that they don't need, they're not getting the care that they need in an actual emergency. And I think that that's more something that we should be focusing on. All right. Is rainbow fentanyl a thing? So the short answer here is no. And I'll tell you why. So this is a bit more opinion based than fact based, because like anybody can apply a name to anything and be like it's a thing. And often that's what happens. So shock value labels like rainbow fentanyl tend to be developed by law enforcement, media, laboratory staff. They do not reflect how drugs are perceived, discussed, or represented among the people who use them. Another example of this is when I was living in Atlanta. This was I want to say 2016 or 2017. There was a pretty gross batch of opioids that was going around that was causing a lot of harm, catching people off guard with its strength. So people, again, couldn't assess their dose and were overdosing accidentally. And it got labeled in the media gray death. And so much of the discourse was like, oh, people who use drugs, they're so cavalier. It's like they'll even joke about their own death and they'll call it great death. What drove me crazy about that is that people who use drugs didn't call it gray death. It was actually like a summer intern at the medical examiner's office who came up with that name. Probably someone who was a bit young and cavalier themselves, probably didn't recognize how stigmatizing a label like that could be. It got picked up by media and ran with it. So like, these names don't actually give us any reflection of what people who interact with these substances are thinking and doing and strategizing. When it comes to these fake pills, we do know that smoking, I use the term smoking very loosely, vaporizing fentanyl pills is now the most common route of administration for fentanyl in many parts of the United States. And this method is so much safer than injecting, right? Not using fentanyl at all is safer than using fentanyl. But if you are going to use fentanyl, I would be very happy if you were interested in a route of administration other than injection, right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. And these are places where like, especially on the West Coast, no one thinks these are real. And if someone does get a hold of these and thinks they're real, that's a public education problem, right? Not like a counterfeit drug problem. And also colored additives can differentiate the supply in really important ways. So, sometimes the point is to be overtly clear that these are not real pills, or even just to distinguish one batch, whether it's pressed into a pill or not, from another. And I want to give you a couple of examples. So I've been embarking on a project, honestly, one of the most fun and interesting projects I've done in a while, where I'm doing drug checking with individuals who use drugs on a regular basis. And essentially, I'm working with them and talking to them as they collect samples and submit samples for drug checking every single time they purchase, right? That's not how most people interact with drug checking, but I'm like, let's just get like a solid baseline of like everything that's coming your way so we know how much variability each individual person is subject to. So there's an individual that I have been working with in central North Carolina, and her products, I mean, it's dope. It's opioids. When I ask her what she expects it to be, it's, fent, probably some xylazine. The GCMS, or the gas chromatography mass spectrometry results, come back looking like this. So this was a purple powder. We're going to get above my pay grade really quickly, and I would refer you to the UNC opioid data lab for more specific technical questions. But as I understand it, it's not entirely wrong to say that the sort of amplitude of these peaks are somewhat analogous to like ratios of things in the substance that was tested. So we have fentanyl, okay, primary ingredient in this, 4-ANPP, which is a fentanyl precursor, right? Think about it like it's the lumps of flour that are still in your pancake batter, just didn't get synthesized. We've got Tylenol down there. Why? Great question. Couldn't tell you. Erythritol, it's a cut, a sweetener. And dimethyl sulfone, which is a cut often found in meth. What is it doing in fentanyl? Also great question. Couldn't tell you. This is not my favorite product that I've ever seen. There's a lot of junk in it. And it was purple. I mean, like purple, like someone broke open a Crayola marker, right? The next day, she had a chunky green powder, bright green. Green. So you probably will recognize the fentanyl and 4-ANPP peaks right there. It was primarily Tylenol. And at this point, I'm like, oh my God, baby, your liver. Like that's the thing that really scares me. And then there was lidocaine in there. Oh, okay. The next day, she had a dark blue powder. And by dark blue, I mean it looked like someone crushed up one of those tabs that you dye Easter eggs with, right? So we have the fentanyl and 4-ANPP there, same, peaks, but it's primarily xylazine. And this is like on a day-to-day basis. This is what she's getting. And so, the I think secondary takeaway point of this is that like when we talk about safe supply, this is the alternative. Like this is garbage, and it really breaks my heart that someone is just not able to procure safer drugs for themselves. Like, she's in charge of herself. She's allowed to do drugs if she wants to, as far as our interpersonal relationship is concerned. But I would love for her to have the capacity to be like, can I have it without xylazine now? Right. But the primary takeaway here is that just like stuff is colored, like food coloring is used all the time. Everyone has a different philosophy about why it's being used. It's to brand things, it's to differentiate things, it's to see how far their product is circulating in the community. It's fun. Right. I literally met a Coke supplier in Boston on a particular product who was like turning his Coke bright pink. And when we asked why, he was like, it's fun. Right. So it doesn't necessarily mean anything. And it's absolutely not targeted towards young people, right? Like we're not having a Joe the Camel moment. It is a reality that stuff is colored, but just I mean, it's just the reality. I would take that fact and move forward with that fact and inform people that need to be informed appropriately, but not read any deeper into it. All right, fentanyl-laced cannabis. So this is another thing that really, really, yeah, this gets me a little bit. And part of the reason why this is the myth that won't die. I'm very confident that it is a myth. As an anthropologist that literally study, I have a PhD in myth, like literally, and it hits all of it's sort of like razors and Halloween candy, right? It's a myth that just hits all of our insecurities and fears, and it won't die because it is almost so custom made to terrify us that we kind of can't look away. And so I throw up this image because I kind of start with this analogy, and I love doing it because I have a colleague with a teenage daughter that trolls me with pictures of Cool Ranch Doritos for weeks every time after I give this presentation. It's part of our sort of like avuncular relationship. But this is often the thing that I say in presentations that gets the strongest response from the audience. And that is, in my personal opinion, Cool Ranch Doritos are categorically disgusting. Like absolutely gross. And honestly, if my relationship ends in divorce, it's going to be over this particular conflict because my partner absolutely loves them. But the reason why I bring this up is because I think it's important to remember, as I mentioned earlier, there's 8 billion people in the world. There is no accounting for human taste. There are intelligent people out there. I live with one of them who like these. God bless, right? So I cannot tell you what every single person is or is not doing in their own living room. I cannot tell you that there's not someone talking to a friend who's like, dude, I have the wildest idea. Let's try it. I can't account for all humans, but I can tell you what we know about ordinary people buying ordinary cannabis from like the ordinary cannabis guy, and also just the risk of like encountering fentanyl in cannabis accidentally or unknowingly, right? That's something that we can talk about. Can't explain Cool Ranch Doritos. Essentially what happened is, I think it was in the NIFLS data, it was some national database where a drug seizure happened. There was like a traffic stop. They found stuff in the trunk. They seized it. They logged in an evidence. That evidence got reported out somewhere. And at that particular incident, someone found cannabis and fentanyl, two different things like in the trunk of a car, but there was a data entry error that made it look like the fentanyl and cannabis were the same exhibit. That's how the story started, right? And when everyone was like, should we be taking this seriously? There was a lot of looking into it. There was a lot of follow-up, and we found out that ultimately it was just a data entry error. But by the time we found that out, it was a bell that was very hard to unring, and we had otherwise good-intentioned people on like national stages who were like, oh, and it's even ending up in cannabis now. Like, no, no, it's not. But that's how it started, right? Their more recent one was this that happened in 2021. The Department of Public Health in Connecticut suggested they put out this press release. Officials from the Connecticut Overdose Response Strategy and the Department of Public Health issued the warning about the possible dangers of marijuana with fentanyl. I'm also very personally familiar with this because it says Overdose Response Strategy. That was actually the program that I was badged at the CDC with. And so I actually worked very closely with the individuals in Connecticut with the ORS. So I know the people who are behind this press release. I know the people who saw the data. We had lengthy conversations around this particular incident. And what happened is they had a whole bunch of overdoses that were responded to. And the people who were, the system worked like it should have. Naloxone was there. People called 911. Ambulances came. Everyone survived. But when EMS came and were like, hey, dude, what happened today? The people said, I don't know. All I've done is smoke some weed. Right. And based on 30 to 40 reports of that, a very well-intentioned public servant was like, well, maybe we should just warn people that it's possible, right? Which from a scientific standpoint, totally valid. From a public communication standpoint, that's a monster that you lose control of really, really quickly. What we found out later is in fact all 40 people lied to EMS, and this happened right after Connecticut had, I'm not going to remember the exact statute, but had like decriminalized certain quantities of marijuana or certain quantities of cannabis. And so when people were essentially caught having used illicit substances, they were like, oh, I just did the one that's less illegal, and is what they told to EMS. Upon follow-up interviews, every single individual confirmed that they had lied and they had actually used opioids, right? And so again, it's similar with like the overdose risk from incidental fentanyl contamination. A lot of very smart people who are very well-intentioned repeat these things because they have heard it from other very smart people who are well-informed and well-intentioned, right? So this is the problem when we have a system of sort of trust around the science of this. But I can say to you with just utmost confidence, I would say this to the Pope: this is not a real thing that exists in the world. I wish that cavalier, poorly intentioned people would stop saying it so that well-meaning, well-intentioned people would stop believing that it's appropriate to repeat. Yeah. So I don't blame anyone for believing that this is totally possible. But no. I do, however, want to make this distinction. Synthetic cannabinoids, I teach medical anthropology, and often my icebreaker with students is what disease or health condition are you irrationally afraid of? It's very fun. It's a great conversation. And my answer is always synthetic cannabinoids because they are bananas. I'm not going to stay on this very long. I want to point you to this sort of like practice note that came out of the literature. You should be able to find it online. It's a few years old. There's newer stuff, but this is a nice little ground level, entry level to it. Important things to take away is that synthetic cannabinoids are not the same thing as synthetic cannabis. They are being increasingly used. They produce clinical symptoms of toxicity that are varied and unpredictable. So for the same reason, a lot of you, if you work in public agencies or public institutions, have probably received at some point a computer safety training where it is impressed upon you how you should never plug a foreign jump drive into your computer. In this metaphor, you are the computer and sin cans are the foreign jump drive. Like, we just don't know what's going to happen. It's very unpredictable and it can be scary. They require a high dose of suspicion to diagnose and is treated supportively. So it's just, they're just wildly, wildly unpredictable. Some of the effects of syncans can be like psychosis. Seizures is actually something I've heard of a lot. Other people have just been like, I had a real bad time. But I mean, these things are all over the place. We just don't have the science to really predict what they're going to do. And they look weird. And people who experience this stuff have a really, really bad time, I think is the biggest concern for their physical well-being and for their psychological well-being after this happens. So yeah, when I do the sort of like drug talk with students or youth groups or anything, it's usually synthetic cannabinoids, and I'm like, genuinely, I'm not lying to you. These can be really dangerous. Stay away from them. I'm not going to stay too long on cannabis because Mel has already done a really fantastic job talking about like pregnancy and things like this. But I do want to point you to this fantastic report from the National Academies of Science and Engineering about the health effects of cannabis and cannabinoids. It came out in 2017. Like all National Academies documents, it's like several hundred pages long, but they are excellent at abstracting it. So some major takeaways about what we know about cannabis is that there's strong evidence for its utility in managing elements of chronic pain, chemo-related nausea, muscular sclerosis, MS spasticity symptoms, insufficient evidence that it is or is not associated with certain cancers. We just don't know. Strong evidence of a link with respiratory symptoms and episodes of bronchitis if you smoke it. Smoking is bad for you. Please don't smoke things. Strong evidence of driving impairment, which should be no surprise. No one should be driving high. In pregnancy, there is strong evidence that it produces lower birth weight, but that lower birth weight is on average about 3 ounces. And as I'll mention later, most of that study comes from smoking cannabis, and smoking tobacco is also associated with lower birth weight, in fact, more severe lower birth weight. So that's just something to kind of keep in proportion. Moderate evidence of worsening bipolar symptoms in people who are already diagnosed with bipolar, worsening depression, worsening suicidal ideation, especially in young people, little evidence that it gives you bipolar, and there's a strong evidence of association between heavy cannabis use, especially among adolescents, and the development of schizophrenia. Now, what's really important here, and this is what I want to drive home, especially when we're working with individuals, correlation is not causation. And there could be lots of reasons why cannabis use and the development of schizophrenia are associated. I mean, we already know that smoking tobacco, right, is more common among people developing with schizophrenia spectrum symptoms because it tends to sort of like abate some of those symptoms a little bit. But we know it might be causal, right? It's possible. It's possible that cannabis exposure causes mental health problems. It's also possible that mental health problems that young people are already experiencing and we're going to experience anyway make it more likely for them to use cannabis for like a whole host of reasons. Maybe they're self-medicating, maybe their risk perception is off, whatever it might be. Or it could be a complex combination of factors that tends to result in both. Right. So if we think about what's our classic example of a correlation that is not causal, that incidence of sunburn and ice cream consumption, for example, are linked, right? We know that eating ice cream doesn't give you skin cancer, but you might be more likely to eat ice cream and more likely to get, or sunburn, excuse me, more likely to eat ice cream and more likely to get sunburned in the summer at the beach, going outside in the sun, right? So that's like a complex set of things that drive you into a certain set of behaviors that make you susceptible to both. That could be the case as well. So that's just important to keep in mind. So with young people, when it comes to cannabis, I want to recommend this article to you if you haven't come across it yet, mostly because I love the finding. It's really nice when our just sort of like general rules of thumb about how we think about people are just confirmed by science. And so we have now confirmed by science that youth use cannabis because it is fun. Right. So it's usually something that's enjoyable. People have a really good time doing it. And, whether or not we want to talk about frontal lobe development and proper risk assessment and things like that, like young people, old people tend to use it because it is fun. We do know, the same study told us that youth who use cannabis as a coping strategy for some thing that's going on, whether it's mental health concerns, life stress, need for relief, escape, whatever it might be, they tend to experience more negative consequences, which tells us that they might be a suspicion, a hypothesis from the study is that like, well, if you're using it to cope with something bad, then you're probably more tolerant of the negative side effects because the thing that you're avoiding with it is worse than the negative side effects, right? So, and the negative consequences that were looked at in the study were like forgetfulness, difficulty concentrating, mostly things that were interrupting like schooling and things of that nature. Super briefly, because Mel already did a great job in pregnancy, most 1 in 10 people who are in that sort of like uh, potential pregnancy age report past year cannabis use, so it's really common. We know that rates of cannabis use are higher among pregnant people with severe morning sickness, which makes sense because we have good evidence that it manages nausea. Smoking cannabis is linked to lower gestational birth weight, about 3 ounces. And again, I think we should keep that in proportion. I think it's often, I know many sort of like birthing doulas and birthing experts who are kind of like back and forth with pregnant folks of like, we have this sort of like birth weight risk, but also you are just like constantly vomiting and like you're not tolerating Zofran well. And, you kind of got to like find a place where you're balancing your risks and benefits. And according to the National Academy of Sciences, and that big thing that I cited earlier, the relationship between cannabis use during pregnancy and any long-term outcome is just like not clear. We don't have any evidence that it matters. We don't have any evidence that it doesn't matter. So these are just, it's a lot of uncertainty, but it's uncertainty that hopefully you can bring into conversation with the individuals that you're supporting to develop a plan that minimizes risk as much as possible without infringing on, anyone's sense of autonomy or really taking away certain, coping strategies that might be necessary. And that's a broad statement, not just about cannabis generally. Medications for opioid use disorder in pregnancy. We have covered this today, but again, I will say that methadone and buprenorphine have been found safe for use during pregnancy. Because someone in the last presentation asked a fantastic question about the like monodrug buprenorphine or the buprenorphine naloxone. I think that it's important to point out now that we've had this introduction to binding affinity and receptor activation, the reason why naloxone was originally put into the Suboxone product is it was supposed to be like an abuse deterrent sort of thing, right? That like if someone decides to misuse and prepare Suboxone for injection, they're also injecting naloxone, and so it'll block it. I mean, talk to one person who has done that and they will tell you that that's not the case, that you can break through that naloxone easily because buprenorphine has approximately 10 times higher binding affinity than naloxone. Right? So that should tell you that like buprenorphine is going to beat the naloxone to the musical chairs every single time. The naloxone in this product is marketing. It's pure marketing and selling people on the idea that they can control people who use drugs in these chemical ways. And we should be suspicious of that, right? So these are the gold standards of treatment during pregnancy. Cold turkey is associated with placental abruption. Detox has higher rates of overdose risk without medication. We know that. As Mel said, I want to repeat that no well-designed long-term peer-reviewed scientific studies have consistently found long-term negative health or cognitive effects of opioid use or medications for opioid use disorder by the gestational parent during pregnancy. So the short way of saying that is like being on these medications in pregnancy is fine. It's fine. And in fact, it's really, really preferable because we know quitting cold turkey can be very, very dangerous, especially for pregnant people. And I mean, I'll take you back to what this woman in Central North Carolina, if this woman that I was working with was pregnant, and this is what she's being exposed to on a daily basis, I would take methadone over this in a heartbeat. Like so much safer than the absolute garbage in our drug supply right now. Neonatal opioid withdrawal syndrome was mostly covered. I'll just simply reiterate that the dose of methadone and buprenorphine does not predict the severity of NOWS. I say this because I know that this has been brought up in family court across the US a lot, again, by well-intentioned people, but like, don't be that person, please. Eat, Sleep, Console is fantastic. It's one of the best. It basically just, acknowledges the fact that infants going through these abstinence syndromes are basically hungover, and NICUs are the worst places in the world to be hungover, and you just take proper care of them. And again, NOWS is short-term, transient, manageable. There's no long-term impacts on the child. All right, so when we think about taking all of these strategies into whatever our respective field is, right? We're doing that. We're considering the home visit, right? We're thinking about a family as a whole, and we have different individuals to consider in terms of safety and wellness and support as they're doing this work, as you're doing your work. And so just to get us in the right frame of mind, when we think about these, not only families, but also these like supportive relationships that we have, there's adolescents, perhaps adolescents that we're specifically targeting for services and their siblings. There's adults, there could be adults who are in parenting roles. Hopefully, there's adults in parenting roles. There could be adults who are in other roles, not direct parenting roles necessarily, but also fill some sort of space, emotional or physical, in that household, and service and support professionals. All right, so I'm going to be talking first about physical safety, general health and well-being, and psychosocial well-being. So in terms of physical safety, I include this because this is something that, especially in North Carolina, social workers and other folks who do direct services at home have asked a lot. And I want to emphasize that no one is at risk of harm due to the sheer presence of illicit substances in the home, right? You're not going to like come across something on the counter and be exposed. I do know, I'm aware that there's a handful of cases that are really tragic of like child or infant exposure that has resulted in an overdose or a fatality with fentanyl. I think we do not know the details of these cases. I think they are exceedingly rare when they do happen. And so I'm very comfortable saying, as a general principle, if there is an adult in the household who uses illicit opioids, and that includes fentanyl, that sheer fact alone does not put you or others at inherent risk. Now, of course, there is a risk of overdose, right, that comes with substance use because someone's tolerance might be changing because of different experiences they have moving in and out of drug court, moving in and out of jail, coming in and out of periods of abstinence, or the dose could be changing, right? Someone might lose access to their primary supplier. That's something that actually really, really matters. In fact, the woman is the example I keep going back to, who has like the wildly varied supply. She lost access to a very trusted, stable supplier. When that person was arrested, her drugs were stable. And afterwards, they're just all over the place because she's really struggling to create like a new trusted connection. So lots of reasons why someone might be at risk of overdose in the house. So training everyone on naloxone is really, really important. And I want to emphasize also that really targeting young people with naloxone training can be important. I wanted to highlight this curriculum specifically, Safety First, because it was developed by the Drug Policy Alliance. It now lives in the Stanford Medicine Reach Lab. It's evidence-based. It's really effective. It's sort of like sex ed, but with drugs, right? Whereas we know that abstinence-only medication doesn't keep teenagers from understanding HIV, understanding pregnancy, anything like that. Similarly, abstinence-only drug education doesn't help young people understand the risks that they face or how to mitigate them when they come across them. And so this is one example of just a really, really good educational curriculum. And there's tons of resources that have been developed, like the Blue Book on the right, for adults, when you're like, how do I talk about this? How do I do this, right? And it can be, especially if it's your first time having one of these conversations. Part of the reason why I want to highlight the importance of being really open and honest and providing risk reduction education to young people is because of something that happened in Plano, Texas in 1999. There's plenty of other examples, but this is one that's important to me. This is an excerpt from an article in Texas Monthly that came out in January 1999. And it reads, Plano, it's a north suburb of Dallas, is the suburban ideal taken to its extreme, and its exaggerated scale often gives rise to exaggerated problems. In this backdrop, this is the backdrop on which suburbia's failings, particularly for teenagers, often first unfold in the early 80s when Plano's population began to climb. There was a rash of teen suicides. Now, heroin has hit the city hard. There have been 15 fatal overdoses in the past 2 years. 9 of them teenagers, all but one younger than 23. They came from good homes, had bright futures, a young Marine home for the holiday, a philosophy major at UT Austin, a high school senior preparing for a summer trip to Europe, a football star from Plano East Senior High. The youngest to die was a 7th grade soccer player whose body was found in a church parking lot. So the reason why this example stands out to me is because I grew up in the North Dallas suburbs, and 1999 is the year I graduated high school. So these were my friends, right? This was my social scene when I grew up. I cannot tell you what it was like to be an adult when this happened. I cannot tell you what the conversation around drug policy or safety was among adults. I can tell you what it was like to be a young person when this was happening. And the constant conversation that was being had around this, Plano was this like creme de la creme, super elite, but also really sheltered community. Almost everyone I knew was like, why is no one telling them that they can't do heroin and then go to a kegger and like binge drink alcohol? That they can't do those two things on top of each other and expect to be okay, right? It was astonishing to us that no one was teaching these young people these things. How I knew it, I don't know. Maybe I was hanging out with the wrong kids. But yeah, we were really astonished. And the response from the community was actually not to do any education. It was to hire more police officers who had like drug detection training. And that also didn't work very well because as a result of that, rather than actually feeling safer, the end result is that I was pulled over at least once a month by a police officer who told me that he was an expert in drugs and knew that I was high, was regularly searching my car for pot. And in reality, I was just in like a really emotionally unstable relationship and crying a lot. So yeah, the feeling of just being abandoned and left to our own devices in this environment where these things were all really easy to find and common was so profound. And it would have changed my entire world if an adult had just talked to us honestly about how to die less, which no one did, to a lot of really negative effect. I also want to point out that if we're talking about, supporting psychosocial development of young people, knowledge is empowering, like training people to understand overdose, understand how to prevent the risks of overdose, how to respond to overdose can be help develop autonomy, responsibility, support trust. Obviously, right, if you are someone who is in a social work capacity, you have to find interventions and roles and frames that are appropriate for that person. But if we can teach 5-year-olds to call 911, we can be real with teenagers about this stuff. As far as health and wellness, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that the risks faced due to substance use are fundamentally intersectional. Pregnancy is also a very, very intersectional experience, and people of different genders and different races and different classes experience pregnancy and face risks due to pregnancy very differently. But especially within the realm of substance use, people get treated like garbage a lot. And there is a profound disinterest in I don't want to say disinterest, like almost fear of seeking care, because the anticipation is that they're going to be treated badly, they're going to have their child taken away from them. Like these are often folks who aren't used to support systems supporting them, right? And I think it's really important to be aware and validate that. Race also very much matters, right? We know that there is profound racial disparity in the way that child removal and termination of parental rights is implemented as what should be a very last minute or like last last option sort of intervention for the family. And relationships and social capital very much matter. So in addition to the woman that I've been doing drug checking with in North Carolina, I've also been doing drug checking with a gentleman in Western North Carolina. He has a stable supplier, someone who he has a trust with, has known for a very, very long time, has open conversations about the quality and contents of drug products with. And when he turned in his first week of drug checking, they tended to look like this. That's just fentanyl and a little bit of precursor. That's beautiful. I was like, if someone is going to be using dope, this is the dope I want them to be using. So much safer. Next week, same. Next week, same. So this is what stability in the drug supply can give us compared to this woman who I hate this for her. And when I talked to her about this, she did say that she was experiencing these upper levels for a while with a stable supplier. And even one time she was kind of like trying different folks, trying to build relationships, trying to find a stable relationship with another supplier. And one time she actually met someone who had dope that looked like this, just very clean, very predictable, very stable. And I asked her, I was like, why are you not going back to this person? Because I think we both know that their supply is safer. And she was like, oh my God, I really wanted to, but now my nephew owes him money. Right. So like, I think it's not insignificant that the clean drugs, the men have easier time getting it. The women have a harder time building trust. They have more caregiving duties. They have more people attached to them who can be squirrely. So the social capital just really, really matters is my takeaway. I'm going to skip past this and just say, so when we're talking about health and wellness, adopting a problem-solving method can be really helpful. Right. So we're looking at it's like understanding their needs, right? People use drugs because drugs help them. And understanding what the drug is helping them do can be really helpful in finding a substitute behavior, right? That's like page one of behavior modification. If someone has a maladaptive or unhelpful behavior, what need are they expressing or meeting through that behavior, and where can we meet that need elsewhere? Are they engaging in self-medication? Are they engaging in psychological coping strategies? Are they engaging in relational coping strategies? Like, are they using substances because they are with a partner or a family member or caregiver who has like a really toxic dynamic, and that's part of the way they just manage that relationship? Like, that happens. Or even just to be functional, right? Many people who have used drugs for a long time don't use drugs to get high. They use drugs to be able to like do their laundry and just function throughout the day. So goal setting with people can be really huge here. Those goals can include reduced use, treatment seeking, just improving child safety in the home, even if they're changing their quantity or regularity of use isn't a particular goal. Better balancing risks and benefits or other health and relational goals can be really fantastic ways to do that. I wanted to point out a couple of resources for you. If you're not aware, this National Center on Substance Abuse and Child Welfare has lots of really great recommendations for child welfare workers, tons of resources on their website. They have these really great learning modules, a series of them about planning and implementing plans of safe care, which can be either super straightforward or super tricky, depending on where you are, where you're working, and what the sort of local regulations are. The CDC's document linking people with opioid use disorder to medication treatment, it talks about a lot of opportunities for doing that. One is prenatal and postpartum care, but it also includes primary care, mental health care, lots of other opportunities. And I cannot say enough good things about this. The Academy of Perinatal Harm Reduction. This was started by a nurse, a neonatal nurse who works in harm reduction named Joelle Puccio. I have never learned so much from a single human being in my entire life. They're a national treasure, and they have put all of their wisdom with receipts into this document that you can download from their website. I cannot recommend it enough. I also want to point out that improving health and wellness does not necessarily mean abstinence, but even if it does mean abstinence or switching over to treatment, it does not necessarily mean disconnecting from supports for people who do use drugs. In fact, there's a lot of work that's being done now looking at and discovering the really, really impressive effect of offering treatment within syringe service settings. Example, right? So there's a couple examples of this in the real world. One that I'm aware of, this just happens to be on my radar because I was part of an evaluation team that worked with them for a minute during COVID. But on Cape Cod, there's two groups, Duffy, which is a BUP clinic, and AIDS Support Group, which has a needle exchange. They're about a block away from each other, and they co-enroll people in their programs. So people move back and forth between the BUP program, the syringe program constantly. They have a shared EMR. They have shared patient-centered goals. A lot of conversation today has been about trauma-informed practices. Trauma-informed practice is meeting your BUP provider in the syringe exchange while you're picking up condoms and needles and have them asking how you're doing. Right? That's amazing. I also want to point out, and again, this is just something that I happen to be aware of. It's not the only example, but the North Carolina Survivors Union in Greensboro, they run a syringe exchange, and they have had first a partnership with Duke, and now they're moving on with other sort of telehealth-based things. But they offer buprenorphine in their syringe exchange. So they do telehealth work with that, right? You still have to get the bup at the CVS and follow all the rules, but you can walk in, pick up syringes, pick up naloxone, talk to a community health worker, and like get a same-day appointment to initiate buprenorphine in the syringe exchange. It's been wildly successful. For people who just want to reduce use, harm reduction, harm reduction, harm reduction, there's a whole list of places that provide services in North Carolina on the DHHS website. And for folks who have challenges accessing those for whatever reason, I want to make you aware of Next Distro, which is a wonderful organization that provides mail-based harm reduction services, which is so important for some people. And then I'll close out with this. So psychosocial well-being. I think we often have carried around this myth, which is very untrue, that substance use has to be rooted in trauma. Not all substance use is based in trauma, but the way that people who use substances are treated is inherently traumatizing. I think that's a very, very important thing to keep in mind. I threw up this ad. This is actually a sort of like awareness raiser, a call to action for a New York state law, a bill that was under consideration last year. It's called the Informed Consent Bill. They were trying to make it law that pregnant patients had to provide consent for healthcare providers to run drug tests on them. Right. And it's astonishing to me that we still so regularly believe that people who use drugs are so subhuman that we have a right to know what's in their bodies, that we have a right to collect their specimens, a right to take their urine, a right to take their blood. It doesn't get written about a lot, but I know multiple people in North Carolina who have experienced forced catheterization because healthcare providers believed that they had a right to access their urine to test it for drugs. That's traumatizing, right? That is why people do not seek care. This is another excellent article about why people just simply do not want to access healthcare. I also want to point you to this. This is actually my article about xylazine wounds, but I talked to a lot of folks about specific instances of healthcare mistreatment when they were experiencing xylazine-related issues. This is one excerpt. Interviewees expressed concerns about the poor management of xylazine withdrawal, which was widely described as severe, like it lasts a lot longer than opioid withdrawal, a lot more anxiety. Multiple interviewees spoke of patients who experienced such inadequate withdrawal management, and withdrawal management is just, you respond to symptoms, right? It's not like, oh, we don't know how to, if they're in pain, you treat the pain. If they're nauseous, you treat the nausea. Multiple interviewees spoke of patients who experienced such inadequate withdrawal management that they asked friends to deliver illicit drugs to their hospital bed. Multiple interviewees. One harm reductionist recalled, hospital staff would not control this person's withdrawals. They would not control her pain. They accused her of drug-seeking behavior, so she shot up in the hospital room because they wouldn't control her pain and her withdrawals, and she overdosed in the room. Another story, and I will just say that this one comes from North Carolina. Interviewees reported facing severe stigma when presenting to healthcare institution with xylazine-associated wounds. So these big skin ulcers people have. One harm reductionist expressed frustration with medical professionals that won't do shit about the infections and wounds out of judgment and stigma and discrimination. And others reported knowing several people who had been going to local hospitals and getting their wounds debrided with no local anesthetic for punitive reasons. Okay. This, based on all the time that I've spent in hospitals, is kind of the norm for a lot of people, especially those who are most hard up and have the hardest time taking care of themselves. I'm going to I was going to make a comment about language. I think it's kind of astonishing that even in this day and age, in the year of our Lord 2024, we're still using terms like substance abuse, even though we have had science that tells us that it evokes negative reactions and is stigmatizing for almost 2 decades now. It's not been in the DSM for more than a decade. The White House asked us to stop using it in 2016. The AP said to stop using it in 2017. And even I could not find an ACEs illustration online that didn't use the term substance abuse. Like, we are not bringing our best selves to this conversation, right? But young people also experience direct and indirect consequences of trauma. I want us to think critically about this, though, right? We know that under quote unquote household dysfunction, substance use is listed here. But I want us to think critically about why is substance use in the household so commonly associated with trauma, right? I would argue that it's not the sheer fact of the substance use. I would argue that it is the trauma that the parent is undergoing as a result of their substance use at the hand of caring professions that is ultimately traumatic. So thinking about this in a trauma-informed approach, I just wanted to plug briefly this book, Trauma and Recovery by Judith Herman. If you have not read this, literally stop what you are doing. Like, close the webinar, cancel your meetings, tell your friends you got to watch part 2 of Bridgerton later. Like, read this. This is an incredible book that has been so revelatory for me and eye-opening, and it discusses all of this. Someone asked a very smart question earlier of like, when we try to do trauma-informed things, is it going to, possibly offend someone? Well, good trauma-informed care just lets other people know that they're in charge. And no one should be offended by that, ultimately, right? I was even thinking earlier of the original Jurassic Park movie that came out when I was a kid. I played the theme song in middle school orchestra. But there's that scene, if you remember, where the guy's like, the raptors are testing the fence. They remember, right? Providing trauma-informed care is being the fence, is allowing yourself to be tested, allowing yourself to show that you are going to be consistent and going to be there, because people have been through horrible treatment with other care providers and they like want to be very confident that you are going to consistently show up for them before they put trust in you for that. We can look at skills-based stuff. We can mitigate structural harms through institutional navigation. There's so many things that we can do to help support psychosocial well-being. I'm going to close out with this, that I think one of the things is really, really important to pay attention to is not just what patients think or the people we're serving think, not just what experts think, but people who we're serving who are also experts exist out there. And while there's not necessarily materials that focus specifically on home visits or foster care or family dynamics, there are resources out there that can help you unpack the way in which people who use drugs want to be treated, the way in which they perceive things as insults, perceive things as slights, how like you can go about acting in a way that communicates mutual respect. A really great place to start is this Research 101 manifesto from Vancouver, put together by the Vancouver area network of people who use drugs, about doing ethical research. There's also the Methadone Manifesto, which is largely written by a patient. If I'm going through this, there's, two researchers on this, David and Sarah. The rest are folks who are active in drug user activism, including here in North Carolina, where they share their lived experience of what it's like to be a methadone patient trying to take care of themselves. Substance use remains illegal. I have a nephew who still has panic attacks as an adult because his father was a pretty significant cannabis dealer in Texas, and he was subject to no-knock warrants on a regular basis as a child, right? So some of the Children's Partnership has really great stuff. And then finally, I'll point you to Harm Reduction Works. This is my last slide. Harm Reduction Works is a mutual aid meeting that is not organized around 12-step. And when people, because of my line of work, I have, random Facebook folks, spouses of colleagues, like people regularly come to me asking if I just happen to know anything that they could do to help themselves or help others that isn't 12-step oriented. And this is what I point them to. It's a really, really fantastic online mutual support group that was put together by a trained social worker, Albie Park, who's based in, I believe, Northampton, Massachusetts, also one of my favorite people in the world. Yeah, it's a really, really fantastic resource that has helped a lot of people. So I will end there. I have not been monitoring the chat because I don't have enough monitors on my computer. So I'm sorry if I blew through any questions that anyone had, but.
There were many, so if it's okay with you, can we get them to you? Either if you can stay on for a few minutes now and add them in
Yes.
the chat and Q&A, or we can send them to you, whichever you prefer.
I certainly have time.
That was a
I
great.
intended to leave time for questions, but I'll repeat that I had an outpatient operation last week. So I'm apparently moving a little slower than I usually do today. So thank you for your patience.
You moved plenty fast, and I really appreciated your perspective. It's a different one, and really enjoyed it. You touched a few nerves with your Cool Ranch comment.
I
know. Which I'm sure you knew you would. But thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.